I had money enough to buy the whole valley twice over, and not one thing worth thanking God for. The night my horse went down in the snow 3 miles short of anywhere. That was a Christmas Eve, near 40 years gone, and I have told it careful to my grandchildren every winter since, because it is the only story I own that matters. The rest, the herds, the deeds, the men who took their hats off when I rode into Ledger Flats, the rest was just weather. This is the one that made me. I was a hard man then. I want that understood before I say another word about her, because otherwise you will think I was some poor lost soul she took in out of pity, and it was not like that. I was Amos Kincaid. I ran the Rafter K off the Powderhorn, better than 11,000 head under my brand, riders who would have ridden into a river if I pointed at it, and a house with more rooms than I had ever once sat in. I had built all of it out of nothing but stubbornness and a kind of cold that had gotten into me and never left. 6 years before that night, I had buried my wife Sarah and the boy that came too early with her, buried them both in the same ground on the same gray afternoon, and something in me had frozen over the way a creek does. You can still hear the water underneath, but nothing gets through the ice. After that I stopped trusting soft things. A man in my position learns quick that most kindness has a bill folded up inside it. Every smile in Ledger Flats was aimed at my wallet. Every widow the church ladies steered across my path had done the arithmetic before she curtsied. So I quit believing in it, plain and simple. I gave to the collection plate because it was expected, and I gave nothing else to anybody, and I told myself that was wisdom instead of what it was, which was a grave I was digging one shovelful at a time. That December I had ridden south alone to look at some bottomland a man named Ferris wanted to sell me cheap because his heart had gone bad. I told my foreman, Bill Hargrove, I'd be back inside the week and I'd go plain, one horse, an old coat, no outfit, because I did not want Ferris seeing the Rafter K coming and doubling his price. Bill did not like it. Bill had a nose for weather, and he said there was a bad one coming down out of the north, said I ought to take a wagon and a man or two. I told him I had ridden through worse than he'd ever seen, which was true, and pride is a fine thing to have when the sun is out. The storm found me on the 4th day, up on the flats above Blue Draw, and it did not come the way a storm usually comes. It came all at once, like a door slamming. 1 minute the sky was that hard, bright winter blue, and the next it was down on the ground with me, white and screaming, and I could not see my horse's ears. The temperature fell so fast my teeth ached. I had been through blizzards, but I had always been near shelter, and now I was a fool alone on a high open flat with the dark coming, and the cold coming faster than the dark. I turned the horse, a good gelding named Duke. He'd carried me 8 years, and let him find the downhill, because a horse in that country will point himself at the low ground, and the low ground is where the water and the trees, and if a man is lucky, the people are. Duke went down off the flat into the draw, floundering belly deep, and I could feel him failing under me. Cold does that. It takes the try right out of a good animal. I got off and led him so my weight wouldn't finish him, and I want to tell you I have never in my life been that cold before or since. It was past pain. My hands quit being hands. My face quit being a face. I understood, in a clear and almost peaceful way, that I was going to die out there in the dark with more money in the bank than any man in the territory, and that not one living soul would miss me for the man I was, only for the man they'd hoped to get something out of. That is when I saw the light. It was small and it was low, off through the driving snow to my left, one yellow square that guttered and swam and looked like it might be nothing but my own eyes making a fire out of the dark the way a freezing man's eyes will. But Duke saw it too, or smelled the wood smoke, and he lifted his head and pulled toward it, and I did not argue with him. We came down off the last of the slope, and there was a fence, half buried, and I followed it with my dead hands until it turned, and there was a little place hunched down out of the wind. A cabin no bigger than a good corn crib, a shed, a lean-to with one poor horse in it standing hip-shot and miserable, and that one lit window. I got to the door and I could not knock. My hand would not close. I fell against it, and I heard, from inside, a child's voice go sharp with fright, and a woman's voice answer it low and steady. And then the door opened a crack against a length of rope, the way careful people open a door on a bad night, and an eye and a lamp looked out at me through the gap. "Please," I said. It was all I had. I, who had never asked any man for anything, said please to a stranger's door. The rope came off. The door opened, and that is the first I ever saw of Delamero, a slight woman in a much-mended dress with a shawl over it, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, holding a lamp up into the storm and looking at a great snow-crusted stranger swaying on her step, and I will tell you what was not in her face. There was no calculation in it. There was no fear for herself and no what's in this for me. There was only a kind of quick sorrow, the look a person gives a hurt animal, and she said, "Lord have mercy, get in before you're froze to the door." And she took hold of my sleeve with her own small hand and pulled. I want you to understand what that woman had, and what she gave. She had 2 children. A boy, Tom, 9 years old and trying so hard to be the man of the place that it broke your heart sideways, and a girl, Ruthie, 6, all eyes, hid behind her mother's skirt. She had a cabin with 1 room and a loft. She had a fire that was more coals than flame because she was nursing her wood. I could see that plain, feeding it a stick at a time and making each stick last. She had on a shelf by the hearth 1 loaf of bread, and it was the last of the bread. I learned that later, but I could have guessed it that night from the way the boy's eyes went to it and away. It was the night before Christmas, and there was no goose, no pie, no ribbon, none of the things a body thinks of. There was a hard heel of a life and 2 children and a fire she was afraid to feed. And she took me in. She sat me down in the one good chair, which had been her husband's, and she pried my frozen coat off me. And when she saw my hands, she made a sound low in her throat and did not scold me for a fool the way I deserved. She warmed water, using her wood, her water, and she did not plunge my hands in it hot, which is what a person who didn't know better would do, and which would have cost me the hands. She warmed them slow, in water just off cold, working them between her own, talking low the whole while. And I sat there and shook and could not speak and watched a penniless widow spend on a stranger what little she had left in the world. And something in the ice I'd been living inside made its first small sound, like the crack you hear on a river in the thaw, far off. That tells you the whole thing is going to go. "You'll not lose them," she said, of my hands. "They're coming back. It hurts worse coming back than it did going, I'm sorry to say. Tom, the far blanket. Ruthie, honey, you can look at him. He's just a cold old traveler. He won't bite." The little girl came out an inch from the skirt. The boy brought the blanket and looked at me with a boy's hard measuring look, the man of the house sizing up a threat, and I respected him for it and told him so later when I could talk. "Your horse," I got out finally, "my horse is out there." "Tom's got him in the linta with our Bess," she said. "Went out the minute you fell against the door. Rubbed him down too, didn't you?" The boy nodded, fierce and proud. "There's not much hay, but there's some. He'll do till morning." She had thought of my horse before I had. She had sent her 9-year-old out into that killing wind to tend a stranger's animal, and it had not once occurred to her to do otherwise. Then she cut the bread. I have sat at tables since that were an acre long and groaning under food, tables where I was the honored man and every dish was aimed at pleasing me. I have never in my life been served anything like that supper. She cut the last loaf into pieces and she toasted it at the coals, and she had a little bacon grease she spread on it thin, and she had coffee that was mostly chicory, and she gave me the biggest piece, to the stranger. Her own children got less so that I could have more, and when I understood that, when I saw the boy watching me eat what should have been his, without one word of complaint, only a kind of grave attention, I could not swallow for a minute. I, who had forgotten there was anything in the world you couldn't buy, sat in that dirt-poor cabin and could not eat for the size of what I'd been given for free. "You have to take some for yourselves," I said. We've had hours, she lied, easy and warm, the way a mother lies. Eat. You've a long cold in you to chase out. I ate. God forgive me, I was too far gone to refuse, and to refuse would have shamed her gift. But I made myself a promise over that toasted bread, a hard, flat promise the way I made all my promises in those days, and it was the first promise in 6 years I made about something other than money or land or getting even. I promised that this would come back to her 100-fold. I did not yet know it would come back to me 1,000. That was the night. Now let me tell you about the days. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn, the way those quick killing ones do, and Christmas morning came up hard and bright and blue over a world buried 3 feet deep and drifted higher, and there was no going anywhere. Duke was played out and half foundered and needed rest, and the drifts were over a horse's chest between Blue Draw and any road, and Delamero said what any decent frontier woman would say, which was that a man didn't ride out into that until it settled, and I would stay, and that was that. She said it plain, no fuss, the way you'd state the weather, and I who had not spent an unnecessary hour under another person's roof in 6 years, who paid for room so I would owe nobody, I stayed. I mean to tell it honest, so I will tell you it was awkward at first, a big grim stranger in a one-room cabin with a widow and her children, everybody minding their manners and their distance. But you cannot stay a stranger long in a space that small, and I found I did not want to. I found, and this surprised me more than anything had surprised me in years, that I did not want to leave. Christmas Day, once I could use my hands, I went out to the woodpile because I had eyes and I had seen how she rationed her fire, and the woodpile told me the whole story of that place in one look. It was nearly gone. There was a cord, maybe, of poor wet stuff, and it was December, and there were 2 children who had to be kept from freezing until April. A dead husband's woodpile, not renewed, because there was no man to renew it and no money to hire one. I took up the axe, a good axe, kept sharp. Jesse Marrow had been a careful man with his tools even if the good Lord hadn't given him long to use them, and I went into the cottonwoods along the frozen draw and I cut wood. I had not swung an axe in years. I had men to swing axes. My hands were still half numb and they blistered, and then the blisters broke and it hurt like sin, and I cut wood all that Christmas Day until the light went, and it was the best day I had spent since I put my Sarah in the ground. There is a thing that happens to a man who works with his hands for someone who needs it and cannot pay. I had forgotten there was such a thing. The cold in me kept cracking. I could feel it going all day, piece by piece. The boy came out and worked beside me, Tom. He couldn't swing the big axe, but he stacked, and he dragged the smaller limbs, and he watched everything I did with those hungry, measuring eyes, and along about the middle of the afternoon he said, not looking at me, "You're strong," in a voice that was trying not to want anything. "Your pa teach you to stack a rick tight like that?" I asked him. "Yes, sir," his chin came up, before he passed. "He taught you right," I said. "A loose rick'll settle and fall and green wood gets in the wet. You keep it tight like that, it'll dry through by spring." And that boy stood up an inch straighter, because a man had told him he'd done a thing the way his father did it, and I saw what I had never once bothered to see in all my years of hiring and firing men, that most of what people are starving for isn't food. Della fed me again that night, and I made her let me contribute what I had in my saddlebags, which wasn't much because I'd traveled plain, some jerky, a little coffee, real coffee, and a sack of dried apples I'd bought off a Mormon family up the trail and forgotten about. You would have thought I'd brought in the crown jewels. Ruthie, the little one, had come all the way out from behind the skirt by then, and she held a dried apple in both hands and looked at it like it was Christmas, which of course it was, and Della's eyes went bright and she turned to the fire quick so I wouldn't see, and I saw anyway. That night after the children were up in the loft, she and I sat by the fire, a good fire now, I'd seen to that, and she told me some of it. Not to complain. She was not a complaining woman. I never in all our years together heard that woman truly complain. She told it flat, the way you'd tell a stranger a thing you'd made your peace with. Jesse Merrow had died the spring before, of a fever that took him in 4 days. A big healthy man of 34 gone in 4 days, and left her the homestead and the children, and a note at the bank in Ledger Flats that she was fighting to keep ahead of. She had made it through spring and summer and fall by God's grace and her own 2 hands, a garden and a few chickens and the milk cow Bess, and a great deal of doing without. And she would have made it through the winter, she said. She was nearly sure she would have, and then her voice got careful in a way that told me we'd come to the true trouble. Pruitt, she said, has taken my water. Cyrus Pruitt. I knew the name, though she didn't know I knew anything. He ran cattle north and west of Blue Draw, a big, blustering, acquisitive man, the kind who thinks the whole country ought to belong to him on account if he wants it. And that fall, Della told me, Pruitt had thrown a dam across the creek up on his own ground, legal enough, on the face of it. A man can dam water on his own land. But the creek was the creek that fed Blue Draw, that fed her spring and her stock pond and the little bottomland where she grew what fed her children. He had dried her out, slow and quiet and mean. And then, once she was drying out, he had ridden down all neighborly to make her an offer for the place. A low offer, an insulting offer. The offer of a man who has fixed it so you have to take it. He'll come back after New Year, she said, looking at the fire. He said so, said he'd give me till the New Year to be sensible. She smoothed her skirt over her knee with one hand, a small, tired gesture. I don't know that I've got a way to not be sensible, mister. I'm sorry. I never even, she almost laughed. I've fed you 2 days and I don't know your name. I had not given it. On purpose, at first, out of the old caution. Kincaid was a name that changed how people treated you clear across that end of the territory. And then out of something else, something I couldn't have named right then, because she had been kind to a nobody. She had spent her last on a man she believed had nothing, could do nothing for her, would ride off in a day or 2 and never be seen again. And I did not want to spoil that. I did not want to become, in her eyes, the Rafter K, the man with 11,000 head, the man everybody was nice to because of what he might do for them. For 2 days I had been just a cold traveler she'd saved, and it was the truest anyone had treated me in 6 years, and I was greedy for it. So I lied to her. It is the only thing in our whole life together I am not proud of. Amos, I said, which was true. Amos, and I took the second half off the first thing my eye landed on, which was the axe by the door. Ames, I said. Amos Ames. And I told myself it wasn't a real lie because Amos was my name, and I told myself I'd set it right soon, and I did set it right, but not soon enough, and it near cost me everything, and that is a part of this story too. Well, Mr. Ames, she said, I'm grateful to you. That's a deal of wood you cut, more than pays your keep if you were counting. I wasn't counting, I said. She looked at me then, really looked, the firelight on her tired face, and I think she saw something in me she hadn't had leisure to see while she was saving my life. No, she said slowly. I don't believe you were. And something passed between us over that dying stranger's fire that I did not have a name for either, being long out of practice, but that I recognized all the same, the way you'd recognize the smell of rain after years in a dry country. The next morning I should have left. The storm was long past, the drifts were settling, Duke was rested. I had business Ferris, the bottomland, the Rafter K running without me 2 days' ride north. Any sensible man would have thanked her and ridden off and maybe, being a decent sort, sent a wagon of goods back later to square the debt. That's what the old Amos would have done. Square it with money from a safe distance and never think of it again. I could not do it. I stood in her yard with Duke saddled and the whole white world lying open north toward everything I owned, and I could not get on the horse. Because I had spent 2 days watching that woman, and I had done my arithmetic. I always did my arithmetic, and the arithmetic was cruel. She could not win. She was the strongest person I had met in a decade, and she was going to lose everything, her home and her water and her children's future, to a fat greedy man with a dam. And there was not one thing she could do about it. And after the new year, she was going to have to take Prewitt's insulting offer and load those two children into a wagon and drive off her husband's grave into whatever a widow with a few dollars can find, which is next to nothing. She had saved a rich man's life, and she was going to lose her own life's work for want of what to that rich man was pocket change, and she didn't even know it, because the rich man had lied about his name. I put Duke back in the lean-to. "I thought you were leaving," she said from the door, and I heard something in her voice she tried to keep out of it. "Woodpile's not near big enough for this country," I said, "and that lean-to roof's going to come down under the next wet snow, and your cow's got a cracked hoof coming that wants tending or she'll go lame on you by February. I'll stay on a few days more if you'll have the help. I'll not eat you out of house. I'll hunt us some meat. There's deer yarded up in the draw. Call it paying my debt." She stood in the door a long moment. Pride and need went to war in her face, and I watched it, and I understood it because I was a proud man too, and I held my breath. Then she said, quiet, "It isn't a debt. You'd have done the same." Which was not true. The old Amos would not have done the same, would have driven past her lit window in his fine wagon and never looked. But she believed it was true. She believed everybody had that much in them. And being around that belief was like coming in out of the cold all over again. "All right," I said, "then call it neighborly." "All right," she said, "neighborly." And she smiled at me, the first full smile I'd had from her, and it went into me like the sun coming over a ridge. So I stayed. 3 days became 5, 5 became 8. I hunted and I got us 2 deer and a mess of quail, and there was meat in that house for the first time in weeks, and I watched those children eat until they were full, and it did more for me than any deal I ever closed. I mended the lean-to roof. I doctored the cow. I cut wood until there was a rick against the wall as long as the cabin and dry stuff stacked under cover, enough to see them warm to spring even if I never came back. I taught Tom to set a snare and to read the deer sign in the snow, and that boy followed me around like I was the pattern for how to be a man, and I was careful, Lord, I was careful to be worth following, because I had never had anyone look at me that way, and I found I would have died before I'd let him down. And Della, I will not cheapen it by making too much of it too fast, because it was not fast, it was the slowest and surest thing that ever happened to me. It was made of small things. It was her laugh, which I had to earn, which came rare and then less rare. It was the way she sang low to Ruthie at night, up in the loft, thinking I was asleep. It was the two of us working. I'd carry water and she'd do the wash. I'd cut and she'd stack, and we fell into the rhythm of two people who suit each other at work, which is a truer sign than any amount of pretty talk. It was the evening she caught a fever coming on in Ruthie early and broke it with a mustard plaster and cool cloths, sitting up the whole night. And I sat up with her, not because I could do anything but because I could not stand to sit anywhere she wasn't. And along about 3 in the morning, both of us worn down to nothing, she leaned her head against my shoulder without thinking about it, and then thought about it, and started to pull away, and I said, "Rest. I've got you. Rest a while," and she did. And I sat there holding a whole world I hadn't known I wanted, careful not to move, until the fever broke and the child slept easy. That was the night the ice went out of me for good. I want to be plain that it stayed clean and it stayed decent. She was a good woman, and I meant to be a good man, and there was nothing between us in that little cabin but a shoulder to rest a head on and a great deal held quiet and honest in 2 chests. But I knew that night, holding her while her child healed, that I loved Della Merrow more than I had ever loved anything, more even than the memory I'd frozen myself around, and that if she would have me, I would spend the whole rest of my life and the whole of my fortune making sure she never spent a scared night again. And there was the trouble, because I still hadn't told her the fortune existed. I still hadn't told her my name. I meant to. Every day I meant to. But every day it got harder, because every day what we had grew truer, and every day the lie sat under it like a rock under new snow. I told myself I was protecting the good thing we had, that if she knew I was Kincaid of the Rafter K, it would change. She'd feel beholden, she'd feel bought, the very thing I couldn't bear. There was some truth in that. But underneath the truth was a coward's fear I didn't like to look at, which was that I could not stand to find out that a rich man was easier to love than a poor one. I'd spent 6 years believing everyone loved my money and not me. Delamero was the one person alive who loved if she loved me, and I had come to hope with my whole cracked heart that she did, who loved just me, Amos, the cold traveler she'd pulled in out of the snow. And I was afraid, God help me, to trade that for the truth. So I let it run too long, and Pruitt made my choice for me the way trouble usually does. It was the 2nd of January, a gray hard morning, and I was up on the roof of the shed setting the last of the new shakes when I heard riders. 4 of them, coming down into Blue Draw at an easy, arrogant walk, and the man in front, big and heavy in a fine buffalo coat on a horse worth more than Della's whole place, was Cyrus Pruitt. I knew him by sight, though he did not know me from up on that roof in my old coat with a hammer in my hand, knew him from the stockmen's meetings in Ledger Flats, where I'd sat at the head of the table more than once and watched Cyrus Pruitt bluster and grab and get told no by men who mattered more than he did, me first among them. He did not look up at the hired man on the roof. Men like Pruitt never look at the hired man on the roof. That was going to cost him. Della came out onto her step, drying her hands on her apron, her chin up, and I saw her set her feet the way a person does who has decided to take a beating standing. The children she kept behind her in the door. "Ms. Marrow," Pruitt said, not getting down, looking at her from up on that big horse. "Happy New Year to you. I trust you've had time to be sensible." "Mr. Pruitt," her voice was steady. I was proud of her before she said another word. "You've had my answer twice. My answer's the same. This is my husband's place and my children's, and it's not for sale." Pruitt sighed like a man put upon by a foolish child. "Now, Ms. Marrow, I'm trying to do you a kindness. You've got no water to speak of. I don't know if you've noticed, but that creek's near dry." "I've noticed," she said, "seeing as you damned it." Something flickered in his heavy face, annoyance that she'd say the plain thing out loud. "That's my water on my land, ma'am, and the law's the law. Point is, you can't run this place dry, and you can't feed those young ones dry, and come spring you're going to be in a worse spot than you're in now, and my offer won't stand forever. I'm offering you a way out that leaves you something. That's more than most men would do." He leaned on the saddle horn. "You take my meaning. A woman alone out here, it's no place for it. You'd do better in town. Think of the children." He was good at it, I'll give him that. He'd wrapped the threat up so neat in concern that a person could almost mistake it for kindness. Think of the children. He used those 2 little ones as a knife and smiled while he did it. I had known 100 Cyrus Pruitts in my years of business, and I had beaten every one of them, and I felt the old cold come up in me. But it was a different cold now, a clean one, cold the way a good axe blade is cold. I came down off that roof. "That's far enough, I expect," I said, and I walked up and stood at Della's shoulder with the hammer still in my hand, easy, not raised, just there. Pruitt looked at me for the first time. A big rough man in an old coat, a hired hand, nobody. "This your man, Ms. Marrow," he said, and there was a nasty little curl in how he said it, aimed at her, a widow with a strange man about the place. "He's a neighbor," Della said, sharp, "helping me through the winter, which is more than—" "It's all right," I said to her low. And then to Pruitt, "The lady's given you her answer. 3 times now, you've had it. You can ride on." Pruitt laughed. It was a big, confident laugh, and his men laughed with him. "And who might you be, friend?" And there it was, the moment. I could have told him then and ended it in one sentence. I could have said my name and watched the blood drain out of that fat face, because Cyrus Pruitt owed the Ledger Flats Bank money the same as everybody, and I sat on the board of that bank, and I could have bought his note and his dam and his whole blustering outfit before breakfast, and he knew it about Amos Kincaid even if he didn't know it yet about the man on the roof. One sentence. But if I said it there in the yard with Della standing beside me, she would learn who I was from Cyrus Pruitt's shocked face. She would learn I'd lied to her from a stranger's mouth, in front of her children, standing on her own step. And every good thing we'd built in 10 days would curdle in that instant into something transactional and false. She'd think the whole of it, the wood and the fever night and the shoulder, had been the rich man playing at poor, condescending, buying her regard cheap and then revealing the price. I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't do that to us. So I made a decision that was half honor and half more cowardice, and I gave him a smaller truth. "Name's Amos," I said. "I'm the man telling you to get off this lady's ground." "That'll do." Pruitt's face darkened. He wasn't used to nobody talking to him like that. "You want to be careful, Drifter. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," I said, and I let him hear that I meant it more ways than one. "You're a man who couldn't beat a widow fair, so he choked her water to make her weak, and now he's come to collect. I've known your kind all my life. You're not near as big as you think you are, Cyrus Pruitt. Ride on, and take your dam down." "Take my—" he was purpling now. "You're out of your mind. That dam stays. That water's mine, and this place'll be mine by spring, and you, whoever you are, will be long gone because men like you are always long gone." He gathered his reins. "You've got till the thaw, Miss Marrow. After that I'll not offer. After that I'll just wait, and the country'll do my work for me." He wheeled the big horse and his men wheeled with him, and they rode up out of Blue Draw, and Pruitt did not look back, because men like Pruitt never think they have to. Della was shaking, not with fear, with fury, and with the awful helplessness of it. "He's right," she said, low and bitter, watching them go. "God forgive me, he's right, that's the worst of it. Without the water I can't." She stopped. She would not say it in front of the children. She turned, and I saw her eyes were bright and hard. "You shouldn't have riled him, Amos. It'll only make him meaner, and you'll be gone, and I'll—" She caught herself again. "I'm sorry, I know you meant it kind. But there's nothing to be done. There's no fighting a man like that. He's got money and the law and the water, and I've got 2 children and a dry creek, and here her voice finally broke, just for a second, just one word and nothing. I stood there with the hammer in my hand and the lie in my mouth, and I knew the time was on me at last. But I did it wrong. I want to confess that too. I was so full of what I could do for her, so swelled up with the joy of being about to fix it all, that I led with the wrong thing. "Della," I said, "there is something to be done. I can fix this, all of it. Pruitt, the water, the note at the bank, all of it easy tomorrow. Because I'm not Della, my name isn't Ames, I'm Amos Kincaid. I run the Rafter K up on the Powderhorn. I've got money enough to buy Cyrus Pruitt 10 times over and never feel it. I sit on the bank board that holds his paper and yours. I can make this whole thing go away with a letter." It came out of me in a rush, all my pride and my eagerness. "Look what I can give you, look what I am." And I watched her face, and I thought I was about to see relief and joy break over it like sunrise. That is not what I saw. She went very still. The color left her face and then came back all at once. She looked at me the way you look at a thing that has changed shape in your hands. "Kincaid," she said. "The Rafter K, everybody in that end of the territory knew the name. You're that Kincaid." Her hand had gone to her throat. "You've been in my house 10 days. You ate my last bread. I sent Tom out into the storm for your horse. And her voice was climbing now, thin and terrible. You let me feed you my children's supper and pity you for a poor lost traveler, and you're the richest man in the territory. You lied to me. On my own doorstep you lied to me, for 10 days. Della, was it funny?" she said. And now the tears came, but they were furious tears, and worse, they were ashamed tears, and I understood in one sick lurch that I had done the one thing I'd sworn not to do. I'd made her feel like a fool, like a charity case, like the poor widow the great man had condescended to. Was it a fine joke? The poor widow fussing over the great Mr. Kincaid, warming his hands, saving him the biggest piece. Did you laugh up in your fine house? No. You couldn't have, you were still here. Did you plan to laugh later? Tell it at your stockmen's dinners, the 2 weeks you played poor and let a fool of a widow. No, no, Della, never, I swear it. Get out. She was crying hard now and holding herself rigid against it, and behind her in the door little Ruthie had begun to cry too because her mother was crying, and Tom had come out and put himself in front of his sister and was looking at me with a boy's whole heart broken because I had been the pattern of a man and I had turned out to be a liar. Get your horse and get out. I don't want your money. Do you hear me? I would rather lose this place to Pruitt than take $1 from a man who'd play a game like that with a widow's. Get out. Get out of my house. I got out. There was nothing else to do that wouldn't have made it worse. I saddled Duke with my hands shaking, my hands that she had saved, and I rode up out of Blue Draw the same way Pruitt had, except that I looked back. I looked back the whole way, and the last I saw was that little lit cabin sitting alone in all that white country with the creek dry beside it and the great trouble coming for it, and the woman I loved standing in the door where she'd once pulled me in out of the storm, watching me go and not asking me to stay. I rode north 2 days to the Rafter Quay, and it had never in my life looked so much like a prison and so little like a home. Bill Hargrove met me in the yard, relieved and scolding they'd near given me up, sent men out looking, found no sign, and I could not answer him. I went into that big cold house with its many empty rooms, and I sat down at the head of a table long enough for 20 men, alone, and I understood at last, all the way down, what I had spent 6 years building. I had built a monument to a frozen heart. And a penniless widow in a one-room cabin had more of a home in her than I had in 11,000 acres, because she had love in hers, and I had money in mine, and I had just learned in the hardest way what my whole life should have taught me long since. Which of those two things a man cannot live without? I did not sleep. Along about the second night I stopped trying, and I sat by the fire and made myself do the thing I was worst at, which was to look plainly at what I'd done wrong instead of at what had been done to me. And when I looked plain, I saw it. She was right. Not about the joke, I'd never once laughed. I'd been reverent the whole 10 days, but she was right about the thing under it. I'd lied to keep something for myself. I'd wanted her to love the poor man so I could be sure it was really me. But love isn't a test you set for another person to pass without their knowing they're being tested. That's not love. That's fear wearing love's coat. I had let my old wound make a fool of the best-hearted person I'd ever met. And then, worse, when I finally spoke, I'd led with my money, look what I can buy you, as if the fixing of her trouble were a gift I was grand enough to bestow, instead of a wrong I was late to right. Of course she'd thrown me out. She was not a woman to be bought, not by Pruitt and not by me. It was the very thing I loved in her, and I'd insulted it. And I saw, too, sitting there, that being right about how I'd wronged her did not let me off the hook for her trouble. Because whatever she thought of me, whatever I'd ruined between us, Cyrus Pruitt was still going to dry her out and take her home and put those 2 children on the road. My shame didn't change that. My heartbreak didn't change that. And I was the one man alive who could stop it. Not to win her back, I told myself, though God knew I wanted her back more than I wanted my next breath, but because it was simply the right thing, the neighborly thing, the thing a decent man does whether or not he ever gets thanked. She taught me that, feeding a stranger her last loaf with no thought of return. The least I could do was learn the lesson she'd paid to teach me. So I quit feeling sorry for myself, which is the only useful thing a man can do with sorrow, and I went to work. And here is where I get to tell you the part my grandchildren always wait for, the part about the riders in the yard, and I tell it careful because it matters that you understand I did it the right way, or as near right as I could find, having done so much wrong. First thing at first light I sent for Bill Hargrove and I told him the whole of it plain, because a man who's just learned what lies cost doesn't start a new thing with one. Bill listened, and when I was done he was quiet a while, and then that hard old cowman said, "Well, about time something thawed you out, boss. What do you need?" What I needed was a good deal, and I want to tell it in order. I did not simply ride down there with a wagon of money and dump it in her yard. She'd have burned it, and she'd have been right too. Charity from the man who'd shamed her would only have shamed her twice. So I did it a way that left her pride whole, because her pride was hers. She'd earned it, and I had no right to spend it for her. The water first, because the water was the true wrong, and it was a wrong that could be set right by plain law and plain justice. No charity in it at all. I rode into Ledger Flats, and I did 3 days of hard, quiet work. I looked into Cyrus Pruitt's dam, and I looked into the creek, and I sat down with old Judge Ansel Harrow, who'd been on that bench 30 years and did not care one snap of his fingers how big a man's herd was. And the thing about Pruitt's dam was this. It was legal on the face of it, a man damming water on his own ground. But the creek that fed Blue Draw was a creek that had run to the Marrow place and the 2 other little homesteads below it since before any of them filed. And out in that country, the first to use the water has the first right to it. Prior appropriation, the lawyers call it. And Jesse Marrow had filed his water right honest, and on time the year he proved up. And it was recorded plain in the Ledger Flats courthouse in a book Cyrus Pruitt had been too arrogant to go read. Pruitt had senior right to nothing. He'd built his dam on the bet that a widow couldn't afford a lawyer to make him take it down. He'd bet on her being poor and alone. He had not bet on me. I did not need to buy his note or ruin him, though I could have, and I'll confess I wanted to. Judge Harrow, when I laid Jesse Marrow's filed and recorded water right in front of him alongside the survey of Pruitt's dam, did not need me to lean on him 1 ounce. He issued an order the same afternoon. The dam to come down inside 10 days, the water to run to the senior rights below, and a fine on Pruitt for every day it stood past the deadline. Justice, plain and cold and clean, and not a dollar of Kincaid money in it. Only a rich man spending 3 days and a lawyer's fee to make sure a poor woman got the law she was already owed and couldn't have reached alone. That was the water. Pruitt took his dam down. He had to. And he did not come back to Blue Draw, not ever, because a man like that has no stomach for a fight once he finds the other party can fight back. And word had got around Ledger Flats by then just whose neighbor the Marrow widow had turned out to have. And Cyrus Pruitt could not ride down the main street without men grinning behind their hands. That was enough punishment for a man like him. Losing face is the only thing his kind truly feels. But the water running again would not, by itself, save that place before spring, and it would not, by itself, put right what I'd done. That took more, and it took doing gently, and this is the part I'm proudest of, so let me tell it slow. The note at the bank. Della owed the Ledger Flats bank the balance on the homestead, and she was behind. And a widow behind on her note is a widow 1 hard season from losing her home no matter how the creek runs. I sat on that board. I could have simply forgiven the note with a stroke of my pen and had the paper sent to her marked paid. And she would have known in 1 look who'd done it, and it would have been charity and it would have crushed her. So I did not do that. Instead, I bought quiet through Bill, in a way that couldn't be traced back to me for a good while. I bought the winter's beef contract for the 2 mining camps up in the Rockslide district, a contract worth good money, and then I let it be known through the honest channel of the Ledger Flats Mercantile that the buyer for that beef would pay top dollar for grass-fed stock and, being short of hands, would hire local folk to help gather and drive, cash wages, no questions. Work, not alms. And I saw to it, through Bill, that word of the hiring reached the widow Marrow among the first, along with word that her late husband's old milk and egg trade could be trebled if she cared to supply the same camps, the camps being desperate for anything a woman with a garden and a good cow could raise. It was a roundabout way to hand a person a living, and it cost me more thought and more trouble than just writing a check would have, and every bit of that trouble was the point. Because when the money came to Della Marrow that spring, and it came steady and honest, it came as wages and as trade, money she had earned with her own hands and her own cow and her own strong back, money nobody had given her, money she'd have owed no thanks and no shame for to any man living. She paid off her note that way, over that year herself. She never knew, not for a long while, that the whole trade had been rigged in the beginning by a man in a big cold house who loved her and couldn't say so, who'd learned at last that the finest thing you can give a proud person is not your money, but a way to keep their own 2 feet under them. That is the difference between charity and love, and it took a penniless widow and a frozen night to teach it to the richest fool in the territory. Now for the riders in the yard, because there were riders in the yard, and the story would not be the story without them, only they didn't come the way you'd think. The dam came down on a Tuesday. On the Wednesday, the creek ran into blue draw for the first time since fall, and I know because Bill's man watching from up the ridge sent word, and I rode down there that day. Not up to the cabin, no. I hadn't the right, and I meant to keep my distance and let the work I'd set going do its quiet good without me ever showing my face again, if that's what her pride needed. I only wanted to see the water run into her stock pond with my own eyes. I sat Duke up on the ridge in the cold, bright morning, and I watched that dry creek fill, and I watched, far below, a small figure come out of the cabin and stand stock still at the creek bank looking at water she'd given up on, and then drop down on her knees beside it and put her face in her hands, and I could not hear her from that distance, but I did not need to. And I turned Duke and rode away before she could look up and see me, because that moment was hers and not mine. And I'd taken enough of what was hers already. But a man cannot keep a secret like that in a country like that, and by she pieced it together, the water, and the sudden work, and the beef buyer nobody had ever met, and the way the whole thing had turned on the exact day a certain Mr. Kincaid rode into Ledger Flats. She was far too sharp not to. And in the middle of March, on a soft morning with the thaw running everywhere and the first green showing along the creek that ran again, riders came down into blue draw. It was me, and it was Bill, and it was 8 of the Rafter K's best men, and we were driving 30 head of good-bred cows and a fine gentle team of work horses and 2 wagons, one loaded with seed and tools and shingles and glass, and all the honest goods a homestead needs to go from surviving to thriving, and the other loaded with lumber, because I meant, if she'd let me, to build that woman the barn her husband had never lived to raise. We came down easy into the yard, the whole outfit, and it must have looked from the cabin door like the thing Pruitt had threatened her with in reverse. A big man come down out of the north with all his power at his back. And Della Mero came out onto her step, and the children came out behind her, Tom grown an inch since January and Ruthie with her hair in a plait, and they all 3 stood and looked at the Rafter K filling up their yard. I got down off Duke. I took my hat off. I did not come 1 step closer than the edge of her yard, because it was her yard and I would not set foot on it uninvited, not this time. "Ms. Mero," I said, "I've no right to be here, and I'll go if you tell me to, and I'll not come back. But before I go I've got things to say, and I'll say them plain, because I've had my fill of not saying things plain, and it near ruined me." I turned my hat in my hands. "I lied to you about my name, and I did it out of a coward's fear, and it was wrong, and I'm sorrier for it than for anything I've done in my life. I didn't lie to laugh at you. I lied because you were the first soul in 6 years who was ever good to me for nothing, thinking I was nobody, and I was so starved for that I stole it from you instead of trusting you with the truth. That was mine to be ashamed of, not yours. There's nothing about that night you should be ashamed of. You saved a stranger's life with the last of what you had. That's the finest thing I've ever seen a person do, and I've spent every day since trying to be worth having seen it." She stood very still, 1 hand on the door frame. She did not speak, so I went on. "The water's yours by law. Your Jesse filed it honest and true, and I only paid a lawyer to make the court say so, and it would have been so with or without me the minute anybody looked. The work up at the camps is honest work and honest trade, and it's yours. You'll earn every cent. I only pointed it your way, and I'll swear on anything you like that no man will ever know I did. You owe me nothing. That's the whole point of how I did it, so you'd owe me nothing." I looked at her. "This here," and I nodded back at the wagons, the cows, the lumber. "This I've got no honest way to make into anything but a gift, and so I'll not press it on you. It's yours if you want it, and it goes back north if you don't, and either way changes not one thing I'm about to say." And then I said the thing I'd ridden 2 days, and crossed a whole frozen valley of my own cowardice to say. Della, I'm not standing in your yard because I'm rich and you're in a hard spot. I'd stand here the same if I had nothing but this horse. I came because in 10 days in that little cabin I found the only home I've ever had, and it wasn't the walls, it was you, and those 2 children, and the way a body could work all day beside you and want nothing on this earth but to do it again tomorrow. I froze up when my Sarah died, and I stayed froze 6 years, and you thawed me out with a piece of toasted bread and never even knew you'd done it. I love you. I've no right to, and I've done nothing to deserve you'd have me, and I know a proud woman doesn't want to hear it from the man who lied to her. But you told me once a body'd do what you did, take a stranger in, anybody would. You believed the whole world had that much good in it. You were wrong about the world, but you were right that it's in a person because you put it in me. And I'll spend my life proving it if you'll let me, and if you won't, I'll go. And I'll still see the dam stays down and the work stays honest, because that's owed you no matter what, and no strings on it, I swear before God. I ran out of words then. I stood there with my hat in my hands and my heart out in the cold where anyone could step on it, which I had not done since I was a boy, and I waited. For a long moment nobody moved. The creek ran. A cow bawled. And then little Ruthie, 6 years old, who did not understand one word of grown folks' trouble but understood a man standing sorry in a yard, tugged her mother's skirt and said, clear as a bell in the morning quiet, Mama, is the woodman coming back to stay? The woodman. That's what she'd called me, up in the loft all those weeks, the woodman, on account of the rick against the wall that was keeping them warm right through that thaw. And Della Mero made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and put her hand over her mouth, and the tears came down her face, and she looked at me across her yard for what felt like the length of my whole life, and then she said, in a voice that shook but did not break, you cut us more wood than any 10 men. You sat up with my sick child. You put yourself between us and Pruitt with nothing but a hammer, not knowing yet you had any better weapon. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, rough, impatient with her own crying. I threw you off my place. I said I'd sooner lose it all than take your dollar. And I meant it, Amos. I meant it about the dollar, and I mean it still. She took 1 step down off her step. But you're standing in my yard telling me you'd have come with nothing but that horse. And God help me, I believe you, because I saw the man before I ever heard the name. And the man's the one She couldn't quite say it. She didn't have to. She came the rest of the way across the yard fast, the way she'd taken hold of my sleeve that first night. And she took hold of me the same way, both hands, and I dropped my hat in the mud and put my arms around her. And Tom gave a whoop and Ruthie clapped. And 8 hard rafter K-men found something else to look at real sudden. And Bill Hargrove blew his nose like a trumpet. And the creek ran. And the wagon stood full of the makings of a home in the yard of the only home I ever had. We were married that June in Ledger Flats in the little white church, and half the territory came, and Cyrus Pruitt did not, and that was fine by everybody. I did not carry Della off to the big cold house on the Powderhorn. She loved her place in Blue Draw, her Jessie's place, her children's birthright, and I understood by then what a home was and what it wasn't. And so we raised the barn I'd hauled the lumber for, and we built onto the cabin room by room over the years as the children came. For there were more children in time, and every one of them a wonder to me. And we ran the Blue Draw place and the Rafter K both. And if you want to know which one I called home, it was never the big house. It was the one with the loft and the good fire, and the woman who'd taken me in. She never would take an easy thing from me. Never once in all our years. She'd earned her own 2 feet under her by the time I met her in the hardest school there is, and she kept them there. What I gave her, I learned to give the way she'd taught me that first night, not from above, not as the great man bestowing, but plain, hand to hand, the way she'd handed a freezing stranger the biggest piece of her last loaf. That was the only kind of giving she'd have, and she was right. And it made me a better man than all my money ever could. I am an old man now, Della's been gone 3 winters. She went easy in her sleep in the room we built first, with the window that looks down on the creek that runs, and I am not far behind her, and I am not afraid of it, which is her doing too, for a man who's been loved the way I was loved does not fear much. The grandchildren come at Christmas and they crowd around the fire and they ask for the story, the same as their fathers and mothers did, and I tell it the same, because it is the truest thing I know. That I had everything a man could buy, and I was freezing to death inside it, and a penniless widow with 2 hungry children and 1 last loaf of bread opened her door on the worst night of the year and took me in and asked nothing and gave everything, and by doing it, without ever meaning to, without ever knowing she'd done it, she saved my life twice. Once from the cold outside, and once from the cold I'd let get into me, which was the killing one. There is a lesson in it, and I make sure the children take it, though I try not to preach. It's just this. There will come nights in every life, cold and long, when someone is out there past your lit window at the end of their rope, and you will have to decide, with your own 2 hands and whatever little you've got, whether to open the door. It will always cost you. It cost Della the last of her bread and the biggest piece of it besides. But I have lived a long life and watched a great deal of it, and I have never once seen that kindness fail to come back around, though it rarely comes back the way you'd expect, and never on the day you choose. Mine came back as a whole life and a whole heart and a home, and a name I was proud to give her at last, honest and entire, Kincaid, and hers and ours, cut deep now in a stone up on the rise where the creek runs, where I'll be soon enough beside her. She said that first night that anybody would have done it. She was wrong about that. But she spent the rest of her life making it true of me, and that is the finest thing that ever happened to a hard and foolish man, and it began with a loaf of bread and a lit window on the coldest night of the year, and by dawn, I have thought of it 10,000 times, by dawn the storm had blown clean out, and the world lay new and white and quiet, and the whole rest of my life was standing in that little cabin cutting the last bread into pieces and giving me the biggest one. And I did not even know yet that I was home.